Hi, my name's Marc Glimcher, and I am the figurehead, the president of the Pace Gallery, and they let me come here to Pace London too. Gee, we're pretty new, Pace London, as you all know, and the team has put together with Sandy and, oh sorry, I'll get to you in a minute. But you might have noticed a really Calder exhibition, which in all the many years of doing Calder exhibitions myself, I have never seen its like. And somewhat involved in that was the person to my right. This is Sandy Rower, the president and the member of the Calder Foundation. Now, the Calder Foundation, if I can say quickly, Calder Foundation was set up by Sandy 25 years ago when we were both just
a few years ago.
A few years ago. Well, he was 14, so was I. And the proposition there was that there could be an organization built to really protect, promote, explore, educate around the legacy of this incredible seminal artist of the 20th century, and that this wouldn't be something that was done as sort of a hobby or done a little bit halfway, but that it was done all the way. That every piece of information, every scrap, every letter, every note, every shopping receipt that Calder's friends, curators, collectors, ever put together would be categorized, documented, and along with that, a sort of universal knowledge and understanding of what the artist was all about. 25 years later, in all seriousness, I will say they are there. And they have achieved something that is now very much the sort of gold standard of how artist estates, artist foundations are run. And it allows for some unbelievable inquiry into what an artist did, part they played in history. Besides the fact that the show, we had great help from family, foundation, and putting the show together. The information that is connected to each work of art is so complete, down to the histories of the work, the stories of the people who are connected to it, that we can understand the context of these works in a way we never could. And history has a tendency to oversimplify. So here we are to, what's that word, de-oversimplify?
Oh my God.
Complicate? That's my job, sorry.
That's your job.
And so here's another answer. I guess that's it, we can go now. I said everything.
A lot of people ask me about the Calder Foundation. What is the mission of the Calder Foundation? And to put it very simply, I started the Calder Foundation to honor his legacy. So what does that mean? Every question, every exhibition that's posed to us, every proposal, every query gets filtered through that question. How does this relate to the preservation of Calder's legacy? How does this honor Calder? Does it honor Calder? Or is there a better way to honor Calder? When Marc first proposed doing a show about this period in the London Gallery, I came to visit the gallery before they'd even begun renovating, right? Mm. And I thought, what a great space, what a fantastic, beautiful space. You opened up the windows, which was really cool. And it just made sense, made a lot of sense. We have 130,000 documents at the Calder Foundation, letters, he said laundry list or something like that. Is that what he said?
Shopping list.
Shopping list, whatever he said. We actually have those lists. We have lists of words in various languages. So he was going to Sweden, or he's going to was traveling all over the world. He'd write down these lists of words that he wanted to remember, just general words, how to shop, how to buy food, how to order a glass of wine, things like that. I mean, all these lists that he made, they're very, very curious lists. I have a receipt for saddlebags like you put on a horse. Molly, you know what I'm talking about.
That happens.
Yeah.
That happens.
So it was very strange. One day this woman came into my office. She's the daughter of some friends of my grandparents. And she said, I'd like to donate my collection of letters. I have these letters that Calder wrote to my parents. And I was very delighted to see her, because she's an old family friend, but also delighted that she thought they should be deposited with us. And I took her into the archives to show her where they would be stored and how they would be stored, how we take care of them and index them and so on. And one of my assistants was going through a folder of receipts, and on the top was this receipt for saddlebags from, I think it was 1946. And I just picked it up and I showed her, look, we don't throw anything away. Here's a receipt for saddlebags. Why did he buy saddlebags? And I put it back in the receipt folder, general receipt folder. And then I went to the wall and I pulled a binder off the wall of letters to show her how her letters would be stored in these binders and sleeved and indexed and so on.
This was random.
Completely random. And I opened up to the middle of the binder where my grandfather writes to his friend Keith Warner in 1946, I just bought Louisa some saddlebags to use as a purse. It was so astonishing to me. I called all my assistants and said, look what just happened. And of course, my guests thought this was all staged. It was just like a joke. They had no idea that this just happened. So we were really interested in preserving every little shred, every little document. It's amazing, you look at something that has no meaning at all, and then 20 years later you go back and think, wow, that actually leads us and helps us decode and discover the history of a work, or the meaning of something, or the connection to another person. It's very gratifying. But you have to be a certain kind of person that likes that kind of work.
Next year's big trend will be, of course, saddlebags.
Saddlebags.
You heard it here first. So what did we do? So how did this show come about, and what were we thinking? The story of Calder at the end of World War II is sort of a fascinating thing. The story of the art world at the end of World War II is a moment of unbelievable change. I don't know, have we seen a moment like that since? Maybe they did in China, but I don't know. But this was a moment, obviously, when the cultural capital of the world was going to shift from Paris to New York. Now, of course.
But wait a second.
Yeah.
They didn't know that.
They did not know that.
So the war is on. America's in the war, and my grandfather, being a good citizen. First, he tried to join the Marines at the age of 40 some odd, and they didn't want him. He was too fat. His vision was suspect, and he was just generally not fit for service. So then he decided he would try and become a camoufleur, his word, design camouflage. They rejected him for that too, so that didn't work out. But he decided that the big sheets of aluminum that he used to cut out elements for mobiles and sculptures, he was going to stop using them and let them be used for making airplanes and bombs and all that good stuff. And he started picking up all the scraps of metal on the studio floor and began a series of miniature sculptures from those scraps, recycling and reusing all these trimmings and scraps. And his old friend Marcel Duchamp came in the studio right at the end of the war and saw these miniature sculptures and thought they were so fantastic. And Duchamp proposed that they should be mailed by airmail over the Atlantic Ocean, which is a new thing, in these little packages 18 inches across. That was the maximum size. Let's put these little sculptures in these packages and airmail them to Paris. Because everyone thought Paris was going to have a resurgence and be the center of the art world again. Thus I stopped you. Nobody knew that was going to be a shift. But so Duchamp arranged with Louis Carré to have this exhibition. And Carré was very excited, and Calder was very excited to have a show back in Paris at the end of the war, all this optimism. And in fact, that became the theme of the show downstairs, as simply optimism, I think. It's a great expansive moment. So my grandfather thought that this idea of mail art in 1945 was a groovy idea. And then he thought, you know, that size package, wouldn't it be cool if you could make some big sculptures that could be demounted and shoved in these little packages and then flown over and then reassembled on the other side of the Atlantic. So it was an extension of Duchamp's idea, not just miniature sculptures, but let's make big sculptures that can be, you know, it's like Star Trek. You dematerialize in one place and you rematerialize in another place. It was like, that's how far out it was, I think, at the time. There are 3 sculptures in the exhibition, and I hope you'll have a chance to see the exhibition again. I know you've all seen it, but after this little fireside chat, whatever this is. All 3 of them are the beginning of the exhibition. If you walk in, oh, actually they're not. It depends how you enter. But don't enter the double doors.
No, enter the other doors. It's okay.
All right. There's a sculpture called Baby Flat Top, which is sort of a leaf-shaped black like this, horizontally inclined on the base with the sprigs coming out of it. And you'll notice that it's the largest element is assembled with nuts and bolts. It's not riveted, it's not welded, it's not a permanent connection. So you can take apart the nuts and bolts and take all those sheets of metal and reduce them down into a package. That was probably 5 packages that was sent over, you know, enough parts. If you really look, you also see the main wires that go out before the mobile is out here. In the middle of the wires, this kind of weird knot of wire. And actually, it's a double clip which you release, and then it's a hinge that folds. So that long wire can fold in half and then fit in the 18-inch box again. Really, really ingenious and really a spectacular moment for Calder, just being inventive and feeling the freedom and optimism of the damn war over.
And perhaps giving rise to a kind of complexity that just incidentally giving rise to the sort of possibilities of complexity as all these elements are coming together, coming apart. Something's happening at that moment. But before I mention that, so Duchamp you mentioned. I think Duchamp's a very interesting part of the story. I don't know why, you know, people don't realize the relationship between Duchamp and Calder, and if anyone here does, don't contradict me.
I'm a person.
And you are a person. But this is a really, really important relationship, and the relative ages of these 2 artists, what it was all about. How did Duchamp see Calder?
Oh, do you all know who Marcel Duchamp was? Most of you do, right? Weirdo, yeah. They know.
Sort of.
They have an idea.
Okay. Duchamp, you know, is sort of great Dadaist, etc. Exactly the right use of that term, but you know, an experimental artist. Of course, we all know urinal and so forth.
The
fountain. Excuse me. A generation older. Kind of. Art-wise.
Yes.
Art impact-wise. So, how did Duchamp see Calder? I mean, he seemed to be really fascinated by this American artist, and you know, understand that Calder had spent from the mid-1920s to the mid-1930s in Paris. One of these Americans in Paris, absorbing the Parisian art world, so forth, surrealism, Dada, etc., the advances in abstraction. So that was part of Calder. Now, he was also very much an American. And somehow this fascinated Duchamp. No? You're not biting on this one?
No, I like it.
Yeah. And
Duchamp comes into the studio in the fall of 1931, and Calder's just completed a series of works. Some of you know these works. They're like a cigar shape and a sphere, and they have a mechanized performance, a ballet performance in front of maybe a colored panel, usually always small scale. And Marcel comes in the studio, and one of them has just been painted. And he asks, can he touch it? He wants to touch it. It's wet paint, and he wants to touch it. And Calder says, sure, you can touch it. So he caresses this wet paint, and Calder says, what should I call these things? And Duchamp says, mobile. Mobile, refers to motive and motion. It's a pun. He's using this word as a pun. Calder is, as none of you know, an absolute, terrible, relentless punster. And you discover that in his use of language in a lot of the titles of his works. Sometimes he'll title something in some other foreign language like Italian, as opposed to English or his second language, French, to make fun of something or to make it not too serious, to bring it down a notch, which is great. So when Duchamp says mobile, Calder loves that and thinks that's really a fantastic idea, that it's sort of it makes it fun and funny while these are highly rigorous intellectual performances that nobody really understands what the hell Calder's up to. A couple of things moving in front of a panel doesn't make any sense, especially if there's a repetition.
This is 31.
This is 1931. 1931.
31. So on goes this relationship, continues, and it gets to this point after the war.
Well, it's funny actually, because Duchamp actually arranges the exhibition of those works. So in February of 1932 in Galerie Vignon in Paris, Duchamp arranges the show with Marie Coutelier to present these works. And so it says Calder's c'est mobile, Calder's motives, and Duchamp designs the invitation card even. It's really wonderful that he's so in love with his body of work, and it's rigorous, and it's funny, and it's superior, and all these things going on all at the same time. Duchamp's really, so Duchamp organized that show, and he organized the Carré show in '46, based upon the miniaturization of things. Now you're all familiar with Duchamp's traveling, his valise, where he makes miniatures of all of his famous works, and he condenses them down into a carrying case, and he makes a series of these and signs them to his friends, very wonderful things. So you can open up this box, set it out, and set out these miniatures. You can have a retrospective exhibition of Duchamp's work. Absolutely fantastic, super great. So that originates with Calder's circus. Duchamp's favorite part of Calder's, most of you know Calder's circus, right? It's, you've probably seen a video of Calder performing it in 1961. There's a fat old guy in a red shirt performing this circus. So it takes you away from understanding what it was in the late 1920s when he wasn't so fat. And he was performing in his studio. It wasn't for children, it was for the entire, cognoscenti in Paris. Everybody in the art world came to see that performance. The idea of performance art in the late 20s in Paris is pretty exotic. And making these figures that all had action, that were a distillation of the natural, performers. The aerialist would go up on their trapeze, and he'd go through the air, and he'd do his triple somersault, and he'd go to his brother, and he'd fall to the net. Just like in the real circus, just how it's choreographed in the real circus. So the second time he goes up to try and get caught by his brother, it's so much more exciting. They build all this anticipation and excitement. So Calder does the same thing. It does the same kind of choreography in his circus. The circus performers who come to see his performance, the real circus, the celebrity performers, are absolutely shocked that he understood what it was they were doing and that he was able to present that again and so on. So Duchamp's favorite part of Calder's circus was actually the unpacking of these valises, of all these miniature objects of, in anticipation of the performance, taking each one out, taking them out almost like out of a coffin, and then reinvigorating and breathing life into them again, and then putting them back in their coffin, putting them back to bed, as it were. I bring this up because in the exhibition is a marvelous work, which still is in the family. It's a cigar box with 5 little pockets, and then 5 little miniature sculptures, all standing mobiles. Unfortunately, they're caged in this aquarium. They don't move, but they really, trust me, they really move. So Calder in 1948, February 1948, Louise's 43rd birthday, his wife, he makes this gift and gives it to her. And again, it's a miniature exhibition. You open it up, and you can lay out this exhibition. So when she's traveling, she can have her own little Calder exhibition when she's traveling. Now why? Why in 1948? Calder's really has just become the first truly international superstar artist in 1948. He's traveling all over the world. He has commissions he's being pulled in every direction. He's traveling by himself for the first time. He's flying across the Atlantic in an airplane for the first time in 1945. And he's missing his family, and he's got his 2 daughters, and he makes this miniature exhibition for his wife. It's a wonderful moment. We're very lucky that he missed his wife and that he made her this.
She's missed him, or maybe quite a few more of those.
Yeah.
But, so...
Did you tell everybody to ask questions?
No, I didn't mention that. Oh, yeah, interrupt us.
Yeah.
Please interrupt us at any time. Okay, there's no problem. Okay, although I'll tell you to be quiet. Anyway, so here's
no, wait. He's not joking.
I'm kidding. But let me say, here's what I'm saying.
He's joking.
How about that? Okay, so, you've got this incredible artist, this famous artist, who is most concerned, if I can oversimplify, and I'm talking about Duchamp, with the idea that art refuses to have its normal function. It doesn't sit on an easel, it doesn't do what art is supposed to do, it doesn't stay in its proper place. He's, it's a great rebellion that he's mounting, and he's sort of mounting alone at first. And we all know about this piece, the fountain, it's a urinal, but it's more than just, it's not just a joke. As Sandy was saying, the idea that something is both, can seem a joke, but it's also, is a challenge that these artists knew no one was going to understand probably during their lifetime, and they were right.
James Johnson Sweeney said about Calder, it's serious without seeming to be. I love that quote.
So clearly, Duchamp saw this in this other artist. He saw that he was completely not adhering to any of these standard rules of what is art, what is its place, how is it made, and it seems from his action that it feels like he saw someone who finally, was carrying the torch on, because it's very rare to see an artist become the great promoter of another artist, which he was. And this moment that the show is downstairs seems to be sort of where, not that this was the end of Duchamp and his relationship, but it really, as you say, pushed, Calder went off into a position in the art world that really didn't exist before. First, certainly never existed for an American, and it really didn't exist for anybody. That the art was needed by people all over the world and known by people all over the world. But any Calder exhibition, but very clear downstairs, is that back then, this wasn't something anyone had ever seen before. As I was saying, a sculpture was built up out of clay, chipped down out of stone. Painting was on canvas, hung on the wall. These things had their place. They didn't live in the same place we lived. We looked at them, we could come very close to them, a sculpture, you could walk around. But there was no installation art before Calder. There was no monumental public art before Calder. Art didn't live in this place, and it didn't look like something you'd never seen before. Certainly, abstraction led to this possibility, but do you feel like, now I'll turn into a question, feel like people started to get it in this period right after the war, that this artist was redefining what's art? What is it? Just say yes.
Yes.
Any questions?
What was that?
People were getting it, right? I mean, people in the world were getting it. People in 1937 were not getting it. the way they were getting it in 1947. That he had, you know, shaken up, broken up what was the order of things. We're rather partial, by the way, to Calder. I don't know if you realize that or not. We're a little partial to it. But we're the only ones with the microphones. Yeah. Okay. Oh, question.
Please say it, thank you.
So this is great. My name is Bonnie Malloy, and I'm doing my PhD on Calder at the Foretold.
You're a genius.
Whoa.
I'm actually with the relationship of Calder with other artists. A lot of them, like Duchamp, wrote extensively and had theories that they were interested in. What did Calder, did he, in the 30s and 40s, were there any texts that he was reading or discussing with other artists, or that he himself felt were important? What did he like to read or look into?
It's a great question. Calder's library has not yet been archived. So that is good. The answer to that question is in the future. We have Calder's library in his Connecticut house, the house he bought in 1933, and it still exists virtually as the day he died. So I can't answer you so specifically, but I can tell you that Calder did write about his work. You can find numerous writings on our website on calder.org. You probably read all those already, right? Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, Calder didn't feel, in feeling misunderstood, he felt it was better to put his energy into making work than trying to justify or explain his work. It was a much better way to spend his energy. And there were enough people that got what he was up to, or felt that they got what he was up to, for him to keep going on. You know, he'd have a show of 15 objects at Pierre Matisse Gallery, and they'd sell 3, and he could keep going on. So that was fine. That was totally fine with him. But he didn't leave behind a tremendous archive of
Theory.
not just theory, but association, connections, influences, and so forth. In studying his work, we can go back and we can begin to debunk and decode certain things that art historians have developed some wild and wacky ideas about Calder, and it's been very helpful to go back. So by 1934, if you go back to the Duchamp, right, in the fall of 31, seeing these motorized contraptions and calling them mobile, by 34, still people didn't understand that Calder was defining the essential nature of things. So now the physicists talk about the 13th dimension. We're talking about unifying forces, we're talking about string theory. Calder's work in those first few years, the abstract work, was about what is that binding force between all of us? And nobody had a clue what he was expressing, because it was an intuitive process, it was a non-scientific process. So by 1934, everybody's writing Calder, the universe. So if there's a sphere, it has to be the sun or it has to be the moon. Or it has to be Pluto. It has to be the 13th planet that's discovered and written about. There's one art historian that's written all about the discovery of a new planet, and that's what Calder was addressing entirely. It's totally not correct.
Because it was a mobile with 10 round balls. So
No,
that's 10 had to do.
that's just nonsense. If you look at the titles of his works up to before 1934, so in 1934 he made a sculpture and he called it A Universe. Not the universe, not just universe, but a universe, meaning an alternate universe to our universe. Meaning, let's explore alternatives, meaning let's follow through a universal process in discovery. Not, isn't it funny that the red ball goes up and comes back down again, and so does the sun sort of somehow, well, in the old days, traverse the globe, right? Yeah, your turn.
Okay, no problem. So I'm so glad you brought that up. So there is, these things are very closely tied, and this is what your PhD should be about. The fact that we had an artist that was breaking out of all these fixed systems, and we had an artist who was concerned with not the illustration, as Sandy's saying, but concerned with the essential nature of space and forces and the physical universe that we inhabit. which includes the mental universe as well, of course. But you've had now in the 30s, you've had decades of of modernism, which of course is coming from, to oversimplify again, Sigmund Freud, etc., and the sense of the life of the mind, and all of the torment and conflict and so forth and so on. And this was the essential nature of modern art, was exposing, what was inside. And Calder comes along and he is exposing what is outside. Not that that's not inside as well, but that the experience of living in this place, you can become enlightened about it by observing how these works of art function. And of course, Einstein and the entire scientific community is in a way at this point starting to take precedence and sort of public interest over that sort of psychological approach. There's a good Einstein story about that universe, no? It's a different one.
No, that's
Yeah, that's right, isn't it?
40 minutes.
What is that story?
Oh, Einstein came into the exhibition that sculpture A Universe was in 1934, and he stood in front of
That was a big thing. Describe it. Yeah, describe it.
Oh, sorry.
They think it's a sculpture.
It is a sculpture. Well, actually, that's another problem, is that Calder didn't really call his work sculpture, because people wanted to have fistfights with him, because it's not sculpture. It's not made out of clay and bronze. It's not solid. It's, definitions of solidity without any mass, and that's not sculpture. That's very, very upsetting. Very upsetting. Breaking the rules, not appropriate. So he called them objects. I'm showing my objects. You want to come see my objects? That was a good.
You were describing the universe.
No, I know. So, A Universe.
A universe.
It now belongs to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it's really it's a sphere which is defined by two hoops of wire that intersect, and then a few lines of wire that go through the sphere, and there's a red sphere, a red ball and a white ball that go up and down these wires, and there's a whole apparatus, there's a whole mechanized apparatus that's behind the wall, you don't see it, pulling these little threads and driving these two balls up and down this mechanism. Now it would seem like, from description, it's going up and it's going down and it's going up and it's going down. That's not at all what it does, because there's a complicated mechanism with a simple single motor that runs these two spheres. One's a little faster than the other, and they do like that. So they're meeting and greeting at all different points along the sculpture, and Einstein could not figure out. He knew, because it's a mechanical thing, that was a repetition. But he literally stood in front of it for 40 minutes until they would return to the repetition, and he could finally be satisfied that he understood what the repetition was. You couldn't calculate it in your head. He was smart.
He was smart. Well, people didn't know that point where it repeated.
Yeah.
They didn't know, and he didn't either, but they did. He was observed standing there, and at exactly 43 minutes or whatever point they repeat, he walked away. So it was pretty good. He was smart.
It's funny, you have to think about motors in Calder too, because those first mobile were motorized objects, and they had a repetitive frequency. So that was, it's a little bit, they're so exotic in 1931 to have made these things, but then, you've seen it, you get it, you see the sequence, it's a wonderful ballet performance. It has a brief existence. 1934 piece was much, much longer. But Calder was dissatisfied with those kind of mechanisms and with the repetition. Many people suggest to us now, well, why don't we put a motor up in the ceiling and suspend the mobile down, a classical mobile, and then it'll spin. And you can imagine what I say about that. I say it's not a good idea. I say, why not?
Like that, say it differently.
No, I'm not as polite usually. But the mobile should exist, and it should never move except when it does, as opposed to always be moving except when it doesn't. It's not supposed to be a repetitive mechanization. It's supposed to be a poetic repositioning, a new composition. What's amazing is you look at a mobile, it's completely static. You look away for a second, you look back, and it's different. And it's also now static again. It's just, you look away, it's moving, and then it doesn't.
You can try it. It works. What when did that happen? So there is the complexity and unpredictability. Well, I don't know about you people in my life.
Complicated life.
Definitely visible in these sculptures. No, but it is that.
Another question too.
What? Yeah, you can ask another
You're
question.
not looking at one.
Oh, it's Farron. You should also ask the same about his stabios, because of course Calder made the sheet metal works that had no mobile elements that you can also see right up here. Ask him that too.
Oh, is it my question?
Yeah,
oh,
it's
sorry.
your question.
Actually, in the little gallery up here, if you haven't all seen, there's a selection of paintings and works on paper and 3 sculptures from the same period that complements the exhibition downstairs. There's one larger painting from 1946 that looks like a demounted mobile. So it's objects in space. It's almost like architectural behind it, and these objects floating in space. It's the largest painting in the room. You can't miss it. That direct relationship is easy to understand. So the problem is that your question is simple and the answer is complex. The relationship between the 2-dimensional works and the 3-dimensional works is really through energetic forces. So what do I mean by that? I mean that a metal sculpture this big can only exist in a space this big. It cannot exist in a space this big. It has to exist in a space this big. So your emotional response to the mobile suspended in this, I wish we had one right here, it'd be great. That big red movement.
Sold. So just kill us.
As you respond to a mobile, both subconsciously and rationally, you look at it, even today, it's sheet metal, it's wire, it's paint. That's what it is. And it's in suspension. And it moves because wind blows on it. But nonetheless, when you're observing it, your brain is calculating. The mobile's moving through space, and in 1 second it's going to be there. But the mobile goes like that. Your response is different than your response is to sheet metal, wire, and paint in space. You have a different response. And I would say it's related to a subconscious response. You somehow recognize a sentient presence. Of course, there isn't a sentient presence. It's just sheet metal, wire, and paint in space. But there's this connection. So those forces of energy, some of which can scientifically be measured and some of which cannot yet scientifically be measured, all those dimensions out to the 13th or maybe the 21st or whatever they are, alternate dimensions, whatever they are expressed in the paintings and are expressed in those little gouache from the 40s also. Maybe you can think about it like this. Calder's relationship to abstract expressionism is not the sheet metal, wire, and paint. It's the present time performance of those objects in space, called gesture.
This was a whole new idea that he created, and they happened in 42, 43, and of course there was a great year of the bronzes, which are not very well known, called the bronzes in 44. So there was this break from the form that allowed a new beginning. Of course, this was not intentional, but it worked out well.
Are you familiar with the Calder's constellations? So for those of you that don't know, pretty much in 1943, he created these carved wooden objects interconnected by wires in space. Many of them hang on the wall. Some of them are standing constellations, and a few of them, there's one great mobile constellation with all wooden objects, polychrome, complicated, wonderful, gorgeous objects. A lot is misunderstood about what those are. Calder said he was he's quoted as saying they relate to some sort of nuclear gases. What is that supposed to mean? Some sort of nuclear gases. I mean, you look at it, you don't see nuclear gases, do you? I don't know. Yeah. What's really incredible is the resonance with Miro, actually, at that moment. A lot of our historians have incorrectly said Calder made these objects responding to Miro's constellations of a few years earlier. And actually, the history, you see, John wrote an essay about this, actually. The history is that Miro made his miniature beautiful paintings on paper pretty much in secrecy during the war, and Calder knew nothing about those works. No one knew anything about those works. They were completely unknown. And Calder he went back to wood carving, which he had last really done significantly in 35 and 36. So by 43, he said, okay, trying to use different materials. He had all these different pieces of wood left over from other wood projects, and he made all these complex carved shapes, and then presented them at his last show with Pierre Matisse, who was also Miro's dealer in New York. Then he and Pierre Matisse had a big fight and they ended up falling out. What's that? Yeah, the Miro constellation. So there's this sort of visual pond, this visual identity between the two artists. It shows this incredible resonance. Miro's constellations, as they're called, well, first of all, Calder's constellations were just objects. And Calder said to James Johnson Sweeney and Marcel Duchamp, Sweeney was curating the MoMA retrospective of 1943, and Calder said, what do I call this body of work? And they came up with the term constellations.
They were into that.
They were into that. Miro's constellations were first shown to anyone in New York at the same gallery Pierre Matisse 1 year later, 1945, 2 years later, 1945. And they were called recent tempera paintings. They weren't called the constellations. It wasn't until 1957 when Breton made a facsimile portfolio of 21 of the 22 constellations. Am I right? Good. Where they were called the constellations. So now in hindsight we think that, Miro made this constellation in 1940 and Calder saw it and made his constellations. Neither one of the artists called these bodies of works constellations either. So this is the kind of thing we decode at the Foundation too. Really go back through the history and see what was what and who was who. If you look in Marc's fabulous Calder, the War Years, you're right, it's not your catalog, it's Molly's catalog, after the war catalog. In the back is a chronology filled with a whole bunch of unpublished ephemera and wonderful exhibition installation photographs, invitations, exhibitions, all this other material.
Price lists.
There's 2 annotated price lists from Calder.
With discounts.
With discounts. No,
Okay.
they weren't discounts, they were adjustments. Because they priced everything and then, well, if that one is $1,200, why is this one $1,000? They should be the same, so they adjusted. Justice adjusted. Okay, enough of that.
Okay, so imagine living with these people. I'm telling you, it's not that seriously. Fantastic. So, what were all those other questions you had? Feel free to not have a question. It's okay. I mean, I don't know what else one could possibly say.
Sorry?
I know you still have questions. You always have great questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Oh yeah, we shouldn't have these talks after an opening evening.
Yes, exactly. I think that's how we started the conversation.
After you were blurred.
Why weren't you at the Playboy Club? Now, you ready to, fess up something? You know what, maybe it's better.
Let's see the movies.
Let's go see the
Why don't you
movies.
introduce the movies? Welcome to the movies. We have, for your viewing pleasure, literally showing 2 movies. Sculptures and Construction.
First, there's...
That works in Calder.
I think first there's a caffeine...
There's a cafe
over here in some
Alright.
section.
Let me just briefly introduce the 2 movies for those of you who want to stay for the films. One, they're both shot by Herbert Matter. Herbert Matter was a Swiss graphic designer and photographer who came to New York in 1936. Somehow, probably through Leger, was introduced to Calder, and they became great friends, and Matter made a tremendous body of photography of Calder's life and work from 1936 to 1950, with a few things after 1950. The Calder Foundation, in conjunction with Calder, has just published a big fat book of more than 300 of his photographs. It's really virtually all of his imagery of Calder. And it gives you tremendous insight because you can see the studio in 1936 and then the Pierre Matisse show in 1937, the works that were half finished in the studio and then presented for the first time in an exhibition. Beyond that, the photographs are beautiful modernist images. So Herbert was commissioned when the MoMA 43 exhibition was extended by popular demand into 1944. MoMA commissioned a film by Herbert. It's really kind of like a, I don't know what you call that. It's an educational film. There's a voiceover. It goes like, when Alexander Calder, you know, those kind of educational films. So it's a little bit annoying.
That's why he picked it for you.
Yeah. What he says, though, isn't so stupid, but the sort of style of cinematography, the cinema presentation then is a little bit tiresome. But Matter's filming of the exhibition and of works in the exhibition is quite wonderful, and I love that film. It's incredible. Calder, Sculptures and Constructions, 1944. The second film is a 3-year project commissioned by the actor Burgess Meredith, who produced the film, works of Calder. So he hired Herbert to shoot Calder in his studio, essentially. And then they came up with this sort of more radical idea of having a boy. So here's the cinematographic conceit: is that a boy is walking along the beach and he sees all kinds of nature, shimmery light on the water, and jellyfish swimming, and leaves blowing in the wind. And then he walks a little farther and he sees a house, which of course is Calder's studio in Connecticut, not the beach in Long Island. But the boy arrives. The boy is Alexander Matter, named after Alexander Calder, Herbert Matter's son. He plays this role in the film, and he walks into Calder's studio and sees what's going on in this magical place. Amazingly, the music is by John Cage, and what seems 10 years ago, the soundtrack seemed tremendously dated, and now today it seems kind of a miracle. So it's super cool. I've watched this film I don't know how many times, and I imagine somewhat before I was born in 1950, it must have been cool music, and then
He was not born in 1950, just in case.
And then it became like tiresome, tedious music, and now, anyway, like I said, it's super cool music. Have you seen this film? Yeah, too bad. See it again, yeah. Any questions about the films before we let you out of your harness? It's in there, right? All who? Oh, let's go in.
Yeah, I think.
Let's go in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.